Hi, and welcome to part 9 of this PowerShell tutorial series on making graphical user interfaces or GUIs. So in this video was actually requested by, I believe, Sharif, and I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly. But we're going to be looking at the DataGrid form element. So the DataGrid form element is really useful for displaying, as you probably could guess by the name, but displaying different data. So it's kind of like a database format wise. It's very much a table with some different column headers, and then in there you'll have rows of data which you could select different ones. So I actually have an example up here. This is what we're going to be making today. I want to start showing you guys what we're going to be making at the beginning of the video, and then we're going to go through all the different processes to make it, and then I will be giving you guys some reference data. So let me just zoom in here so you guys can actually see what this looks like. So we have our window. As always, as our example, we just get all the services and the status of those services. So if I click on one of these, we could actually, let me just shrink this back here. So as you can see, like the data grid is very customizable. So we can select the different items, and the name of the item will actually appear down at the bottom with the status of it as well. And then we have a filter up here. So it's just a text box that says filter and then a button that says filter. But basically how this works is if we wanted to get all these services that started with BL, we would just put in BL here and then click on filter. And here are all the services that start with BL. If you wanted just all these services that start with S, you can do just S here. Let's say you knew the name of the service, which is going to be the print spooler. And this is working on the display name. We could definitely make it work on the service name as well, but this is currently configured to only search on the display name. So as you can see, if we just type in, let's see all the services that have to do with printing, we can actually see it. So that definitely comes in handy. So we will be making this now. So let me just close out of this here. Let me just open up our PowerShell window and let me just zoom out. So the first thing we have to do, of course, like always, is we have to make our form. So let's go ahead and let's just open up Visual Studio 2019. Again, if you are using Visual Studio 2022, it should be fairly similar. I don't see it being vastly different. We are going to create a new project, and we are going to go ahead and create a WPF application. So you could scroll all the way down, or if we just actually search for it at the top here. And it doesn't matter if you pick a C# or Visual Basic application. I usually just have a tendency of picking C# because I have just a little bit of knowledge in C# applications, but this just has no difference at all. All we are using Visual Studio for is simply the designing of the GUI, which is the exact same in both. So we're just going to go ahead and create this here. And then once we have this up, we will be able to create our form. So as we know, we had a text box, a button, a data grid, and then some labels underneath. We can add some different things just to make it look a little bit nicer than what I had earlier there. So let's go ahead and let's just wait for this to load up here. All right, so that should be good for you guys to see for the most part for what we're doing on this screen. So I'm actually going to go ahead and shrink the width of this window. I'm going to make it a width of, let's just say 600. And then the height, I'm going to make it a little bit longer. I'm also going to make it 600. So we have a nice little box here. And let's just go ahead and let's hopefully I can move this, but it doesn't really seem like I can move it around. So here is the window. That might be a little bit small, but I could always zoom in on certain parts. So what we're going to do is we're just going to call it Service Inspector again, because that's kind of what we name all of our applications. If you guys have a more clever name, definitely feel free to leave it in the comments or just put it in your application. So the first thing we're going to want to do is put in the text field and the button. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding a text box. So we're just going to drag that in here. And we're just going to put it just wherever, and we're just going to drag it a little bit bigger so we can put that there. And then we're going to put in a button. So let's just resize the button. And like I said before, I kind of like matching the button to just be the same size as the text box, just so it looks a little bit nicer. So once we have both of those, we're going to go ahead and we're going to select the data grid here, which is usually right under the combo box under the common WPF controls. So let's just put that in there. So that should be pretty good right there. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add 2 labels, actually 4 labels, but all we're going to do first is we're just going to add 2 labels. So for our first label, we are going to put the content set to service name, colon, and then we're just going to move that to a nice little spot. And then the second label, we are actually just going to move it beside the service name. We aren't going to do anything to it yet. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to select these 2 labels and do a Control C and a Control V to copy them, and then move that copy right underneath. And then for the new label, that's service name, we're just going to change that to status. And there we are. So the form is complete. Now, as we've seen in other videos here, where I've had issues with sizing, so I'm just going to make all the sizes to the actual, like, I'm going to remove all the auto settings. So just so you guys can actually see what that is here. So let me just move that and zoom in here. So on the bottom right here, you're going to see this width and height, which is auto. I would actually set this directly to 600 and this directly to 584. And then I do that for all the different forms elements. So I just select the text box. That's actually already set properly. The button is set to auto, so I'm just going to change that to 100 for the width, 33 for the height. The data grid. And what you could also do is actually add it right to the XAML code right in here. So while I'm zoomed in here, it's just width. We're going to say equals to 492. And then the height is going to be 368 for the data grid. And then let's do the label as well here. So if we just zoom back out a little bit, and let's see if I can just zoom into this here. I can. So in the service name, we're just going to do width equals to 91, and then height equals to 26. And then we're actually going to copy paste these ones to all the other labels, because we want all the labels to really be pretty much the same here. Now, the only ones that we will actually want to keep to auto is actually going to be these 2 here for the width. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set that to auto, which actually just removes the width. And then we're going to set this one to auto as well. So to set it to auto, just so you guys can see, if I come here, there's an automatic little X here with like arrows pointing in each direction. We're just going to click on that, and that should set it to auto. So that should be good. Now, the only other thing that we need to do is give a name to all of our forms that we will be interacting with. So we're going to be interacting with this text box. So I'm going to name that txt_filter. The button, oh, and actually I'm going to change the content of this text box. Now the content of the text box, so labels have a property called content, and so does a button. But for a text box, it is actually text and not content. So we will have to remember that when we go into our PowerShell to fetch that data. So let's just put filter, so we know what that text field is for. We should also have a, I believe there should be a placeholder value. I don't know if that's only in HTML because I don't seem to see it in here. So I'm going to say that this is probably not an option. But that's okay. We could just type in filter here. For the button, I'm going to give it the name btn_filter. So we know that those two are related to a filter. btn is for the button, txt is for the text field. And for the content for button, I'm actually going to be putting in apply filter. So this way we know what that button does. It applies the filter. Now for the data grid, we haven't worked with data grids, but going in like the same naming convention, like text box is txt, button is btn. Data grid, what I like to do is do DG for data grid. So DG underscore services, because we're going to be storing our services in there. And then our two labels that we will be modifying. So the first one will be LBL underscore service name. And then the second one will be LBL underscore service status. Now you could just name these LBL name, LBL status. It is really up to you, but that should work. So all of this should be good. So let's go ahead and let's do a file, save main window XAML as. And then in here, we're just going to go ahead and we are going to create a new folder. And we are going to do a service inspector data grid here. And then we're just going to save it as main window.xaml. We're not going to do anything fancy here. So we have our window created. Now, as I always like to do is I like to keep the Visual Studio window open just in case I need to come back to it and make some little tweaks later on. So let's go ahead and let's see what we can do here. So as always, we need to add our type for the framework here. So let's do an add type, and then the assembly name is going to be presentation framework. Just make sure I spell this one correctly this time. So that should work. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to copy paste the code that we always do to create our forms, just because if you guys want to see the in-depth reasoning behind the different steps that we're doing here, but this is just really the steps that we take in to ingest our XAML code that we've created, and then we go ahead and replace some of the characters in there to be able to read it in properly, and then we create all of our variables based on the names of the different labels, the different text boxes, and the data grid. So the main thing that we need to do is change this XAML file to be the proper XAML file. So on my desktop, Service Inspector Data Grid, I will just go ahead and shift right click here and copy as path and just paste that in here. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to run this code. Nothing's going to happen. But now if I do a $var, we have all of our underscore btn filter, underscore dg services, underscore lbl service name, lbl service status. text filter. So we have a lot of things there. And then we name our form1. So we can do form1 dot show dialog open and close parentheses. So once we look at that here, let's see what this looks like. So this is what our window looks like. I would say this looks pretty good. I don't really see any problems with this form. It's going to be usable. So we can go ahead and we can just close out of this here. Now, actually, the only thing that I'm going to want to do is come back into Visual Studio and actually just remove the content from the two labels that just say label. I just don't want that because they aren't going to be... Sometimes I can keep them if we're working on like that second window where no one's even going to see it say label because it gets replaced before. But in this situation, it doesn't get replaced before. So I like to remove those. So let's just save it once again here. And now if we go ahead and we start this, we will see that we don't see the labels anymore. So that is good. We have our apply filter. We have our filter here, which we can type into, and we have our data grid. So that is all awesome. So the first thing that we want to do when we're working with a data grid is to know what kind of data we're going to be putting in there. Now, we know that the get service gets us a bunch of different properties. So if we do a get service here and we just run this, this is really what I'm going to want to display on the data grid. So if we scroll all the way up here to see, we see that we get back status, name, and display name. Another way to get that would be to do a get service, and we pipe that to get member. And then if we run this, we actually get all the different properties that it can actually pass into us there. So we do see we get display name, service name. We can get the services that it depends on if we really wanted to, and then the status. But really all I want to do is I just want to show the status, the display name, which is really the user-friendly name, and then the actual service name. So what we're going to do is we have to tell the data grid that we want to store those columns. So what I want to do is I'm going to call a variable columns, and we are going to go ahead and set that to an array. And in that array, we are going to have our 3 fields that we want. So we're going to have status, and then we're going to have display name, and then we are going to have service name. So that should be good. Now in there, we are going to also have to, before we can put something into the data grid, we have to format the data in PowerShell to be able to put it in the data grid. Now, a way that we can do that is by creating a data table in PowerShell. So let's go ahead and let's create our data table. So we're going to create our data table. So we're going to just name it services, service data table. And we're going to set that to a new object. And we are going to set that to system.data table. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just put the void in front of this because we don't want the output to go in the console, since this will actually create some entries here. So if we do data table, service data table dot columns dot add range, and we are going to add in the columns. So add range is basically adding an array. So if you only wanted to add 1 column, and actually I see a typo here, status. So if we only want to add 1 column, we could just add dot add, but we want to add a range of columns. So add range, and then columns. And then what we want to do now is we want to add all of our services to this data table. So what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and we're going to get our services. So let's actually do that before we create the data table. So let's do services equals get service. And then what we're going to do, since we already know that we just want these fields, we're going to do select object, and we're going to do columns. Perfect. So once we have that here, so if we just run these two lines, now we get services, we actually do get our status, our display name first now, and then our service name. So that should be good. And if we go ahead and just create the data table, let's just look at how the data table looks like right now. We don't see anything, which is completely normal because we haven't put any data in it right now. So let's go ahead and let's do a for each. And we're going to do for each service in services because we want to put in every service. Now in there, we are also going to do a entry because we want to do an entry for every service in our database here. So we're going to set this to an array. Now you don't actually have to do this. I'm going to show you the two different ways. But what we can do is do a for each column in columns, and then do entry plus equals service dot column. So for every column, it will then go into the service and grab the column. So for every service, so let's use this last one, for example. It's going to go in and it's going to be like, all right, so for the first column, which is the status, entry is equal to the service dot column, which is status. So it's going to grab and it's going to store running in entry. And it's going to go in and grab the display name and then the service name. So that's kind of how that works. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do another void, so in square brackets, because we just don't want the output once again. And we're going to do a service data table dot rows dot add row, and then we're going to add our entry. Now if we run this and we go ahead and look at our service data table, we actually have all of our services. So this is actually perfect. This is awesome. Like, this is what we want. Another way to actually do this same part here is to actually just remove all of this. So let me just go ahead and let me just comment all this out. So if we create a new data table, and then just so you guys can see, it's actually empty. What we could do is we could do, we can add an array here. And then the first item that we put in is going to be service dot status. Second is going to be service dot display name. And then service dot service name. Now the order that you put these in is actually very important. It has to be in the same order that you did the columns. If you put these in different orders, it does not have any error catching. So if we put the status in last, for our service name, it would show the status. So it does really matter in what order, which is why this for each method is definitely better. But just to show you guys that it does work, when we look at our service data table, it loads it in. So everything is good there. And if I scroll all the way to the top, you guys will see status, display name, and service name. But if I decided to do this, so if I remove the status here and put the status in the middle, so service dot status, just so you guys can see what happens. And now if I do this, now we'll see, well, we can already see that the display name is first, then the status, then the service name, which we might still think is accurate, but actually the columns shows us the status, which actually contains the display name. And the display name contains the status. So the order is actually very, very important here. Do not forget that order is important, because if you do, you might end up with some messed up data at the end. So that's why I like to use the for each option. So once we have that in there, we just have to finalize a few other things with our data grid. So what we want to do is do our var. So basically what we got to do is put in this data table into our data grid. So we grab our data grid. So for us is var underscore dg underscore services. And we're going to do dot item source. And this is going to be equal to our service data table dot default view. All right, and then what we're going to want to do is we're just going to want to make sure that our data grid is in read-only mode. So we're going to do a services dot is read only. Yep, we can set that, and then we're going to set that to true. And then one last thing we are going to do, we are going to set the grid lines visibility. We are going to go ahead and set that to none just for a styling purpose, but you can definitely set that to something different. Now, the way that you would get to know what all these different properties are and all the different options is through these system.window.control documents. So Microsoft has a bunch of these documents where you can get tons of the fields, you can get the properties and the events and the methods that you can do on a data grid. This is what I used, and we will see. So if we go into properties, and then we go to, let's see, grid lines visibility, we can see a bunch of stuff in it just to kind of see. So the registered default is all. For more information, you can see what influences the dependency. And then it gives you some horizontal grid lines brush and some vertical grid lines brush, which you can also read up more information. And also just in Visual Studio itself, you also have a lot of those options. So if we select the data grid, you will actually be able to see a bunch of information at that bottom, that section at the bottom right. You will be able to see a lot of the different grid lines visibility. You can set it to all, horizontal, none, or vertical. So that's kind of where you can get all your different options. You have the option of going to the documentation or through Visual Studio. Whichever one is easier. I find for the properties, it is a lot easier through Visual Studio. And then for the events, which we'll see in just a little bit, I find it a lot easier through documentation. So once we have our grid lines visibility set to none here, the only thing that we have left to do is to add functionality to our form controls. But right now, if we are to execute this, we see that we have our grid, we have all the services, we just don't have any functionality. I select a service, nothing loads at the bottom, the filter doesn't work, but everything does load up nicely, so that is good. So the first thing that we want to do is when we select an item on the data grid, we want it to show up in those labels. So the way that we would do that is var underscore dg underscore services. And then this is going to be a dot add underscore selection changed. Now you're not going to see any autocomplete on this one. That's going to be open parentheses, open curly bracket, and close parentheses. And then I like to just enter here. So Selection change is an actual event on the data grid, and we can see that here. Let me just make sure that you guys can actually see it. Yeah. So in the data grid, in events, at the bottom here, there is there should be a selection change. Or was that in? I might be blind because I don't actually see it. Oh, on selection change. So it's actually a property, but I believed it was also an event here, but I could be wrong. So on selection change, so we have this here. So we do have a on selection change method, and then we can also see, I was pretty sure that it was a option here. I am maybe just not seeing it for some reason. So if we go into Visual Studio, because I will show you guys how I found it here. So if we look at DataGrid, and we go so we have here selection changed, which is the event here that we just added. So I'm not sure if you guys can see that. So let me just zoom in here. I'm not sure why that's not in the documentation because it is an actual event. So it might be slightly out of date, but here's the selection changed event. So this is what I used to know that there was a selection change event, which is weird that it's not on here. It's definitely quite odd because I would definitely expect it to actually be here. But I would use the documentation and Visual Studio always at the same time. I definitely like using both because if one doesn't have, Visual Studio won't tell you the in-depth explanation, whereas the documentation will. So when we add the selection changed, we want to put in what we want it to do when the selection has changed. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab our $var. So we're going to grab our label for service name, and we're going to be setting the content to the var, and we're going to grab our data grid dot selected item dot display name. And then we're going to go ahead and set our label, the status dot content, and we're going to set that to the data grid dot selected item dot status. So now if we go ahead and we run this, we select our lines here, we can actually see them update at the bottom here. So that is awesome. Now the only thing left to do is making that filter. So the way that we do a filter, we've seen how to add button commands before. So we grab our button and we do a add underscore click event, then open, close, close for curly brackets and parentheses. And then in there, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go ahead and create a filter. So let's go ahead and let's create a variable called filter, and we're going to make that equal to display name, and then I believe it's going to be like and then single quote. And then in here, we're going to do a $, open and close parentheses so we can reference a variable, and then a %sign. So a %sign is actually the wildcard for this. It is not a asterisk. So it is very much like a SQL filtering command. So we're going to do like the $var text filter. And then, like I said, in here, it's not going to be .content, but it's going to be .text. And then in here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a data table, the service data table dot default view dot row filter is going to be equal to filter. So this is going to change the default view, which is our item source, and it's going to apply a row filter to our filter that we have here, which is display name like, and then we can even add a wildcard here. This is a little less useful because if we really just want to say all the ones that begin with B at that point, it would just be any service that has B in it, and that might not be so useful. So I like to just do it this way, but definitely the options are endless. So if we go ahead and run this now, we can see that we get all of our things, all of our services loaded up here when we select it. And then I could do a BL at the top here, apply filter, and we only get the services that start with BL. And then we could select it, and we still have our options here. And then if we erase everything that's in the filter and just hit apply filter, we get all of our services. So that is really how the DataGrid works, with PowerShell being the back end really running the whole thing. So I hope that helped you, Sharif. And if you guys have any questions relating to this video, definitely feel free to leave comments down below. I will be posting a link to the more in-depth video that covers what we copy pasted at the beginning, because I do have a video that really goes in depth on what we're doing there. I just don't want to really waste time re-going over that every video when there is already a video that goes over that. And also I will be putting a link to the GitHub. I will be posting this on my GitHub as well. And I will also be posting a link to the documentation for Microsoft. This way you guys can have access to that as well if you guys need it for any of your learning, or if you guys want to explore some different form elements. If you guys have any form elements that you guys have questions on that you guys want me to cover in another video, let me know down in the comments below, and I will be glad to do a video on them. So I hope you guys liked this video. If you guys did, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and hit that notification bell to be notified when that next video comes out, and I will see you guys on the next video.